Today we're going to be doing yet another session of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons First Edition, and we're extending on what we were talking about last time, which was relating to the freeholds, strongholds, etc. And what we're going to be exploring and expanding on today is in a much similar vein, but as we can see, something that Mr. Gygax had already foreseen as something that players will want to do. For those playing along at home, we're on page 93 of the DMG, and this is one wicked text wall of information about what to do when a player becomes Lord of the Manor. And even as the first sentence says, when player characters reach upper levels and decide to establish a stronghold and rule a territory, you must have fairly detailed information on hand to enable this to take place. This isn't an if, this is a when. So this is definitely something that is expected, that many of the players will eventually get to a point, or those who make it to the 9th, 10th and so on level, where they end up creating their own little fief. So what we are encouraged is to have as much detail as possible from a DM point of view, and also work with a player. So the important thing to think about here, I suppose, someone's going to say, wait a second, none of this is game-wise. I mean, there's a few game things involved when they talk about wandering monsters or wilderness and random encounters, and very little to do with any other aspect of the game directly. So is this specifically for first edition AD&D? And I say to thee, use it as often and as wherever you possibly can. You play any one of the other major games out in the space, there are very few places where they actually discuss and talk about what players can do when it comes to actually creating their own worlds. They want to start to cement themselves in and create a little town, or they want to work their way through a campaign from building a castle and keep, defending it, and so on. So this is all relatively high level. Now from an AD&D point of view, high level, not quite as high as you would think, starting at 8th, 9th and 10th levels, but ultimately the real mess happens when you're starting to get into the 13th, 14th levels and a bit higher. How do you keep the players engaged, and what do you want to do? If the player wants to keep the character going because they love the character, what can they do? And this is where we can really work a new angle. So I'm not going to read every scrap of text. Like always, we don't need to read every scrap of text, but what we do want to do is get a basic idea of where we're meant to be going with this. So for that, we need to look at a map. As we mentioned before, Greyhawk is the realm of my choice. You may choose any other realm or make your own, however you wish. But basically, it's nailed down into two distinct categories, where we have inhabited / patrolled, uninhabited, and wild. And that's the real differentiation as to where the players want to build their castles, as to what will happen next. Now, there are many instances where there are no real borders that define where lands start and where other countries or counties begin and end, and so on. Often they're close to natural boundaries. Once you cross these hills or past these mountains, you've entered into that land. But it's still pretty much up in the air as to who gets to control it. And then there are scenarios like this, where we have Thornwood just sitting there in the middle of Ket, Valuna and Bissell. Not that these are terrible nations and they hate each other, but being in the middle, you are going to be stuck with lots of different points of intrigue and so on. Now, a town like that, which is a small-ish, it's not as great, not one of the great cities of Greyhawk. But when we remember what we did with regard to the fighter, we're looking at the hex and the surrounding hexes. So even if you don't want to take over this particular town, you could definitely take over the area next to it, which encompasses a little bit of the hills, a little bit of the rivers, and you'll have some mining resources, and you'll have some fishing, and you'll have trade between the three areas, and so on. Once you take onto that mantle of, I am going to create my own zone, this is where you need to start to think about your place in the world. So there are, as we were talking about before, there are the two main categories, and we'll have a look at something else in a moment. So the Kingdom of Keeland, as an example, is an inhabited and well-patrolled area. If a player wishes to have that spot there and its surrounding hexes, not only do you need to negotiate with the ruler of Keeland, but then you also have to deal with the other local lords within their space. And that opens itself up for some political intrigue, as well as assassination attempts and general dislike, distrust, and so on. Then you also have the scenarios when Keeland decides to march into war against another nation. Do you follow, and what are the ramifications of that? But coming back to the DM's guide, we ask ourselves exactly what it is that we need to be looking at. And what a good DM, and we are all good DMs, will have is start to build very much localized maps on what's contained within each of the hexes. And the player, and potentially the party as well, will need to start to clear out these hexes and make sure that they are uninhabited of any beasties and nasties. Once they've cleaned up a spot, they can move to the next spot. And within the same sort of 30 mile hex area, you're looking at quite a large number of hexes that they can then just keep going through with inside to clean up. Then, once they clean up the inside, you then have all these other options with regard to wandering monsters coming in, goings, and so on. The idea is, if they've already taken an area that is uninhabited and wild, they want to turn it into inhabited and patrolled, which means that it's a slight change in the overall makeup of the monsters as well as the population. When the characters start building their strongholds, that's a team of hundreds and hundreds of people, which include, smiths, masons, carpenters, as well as all the labourers required, and the little side industries as well, which include the leather workers, tanneries, and so on, and everyone who's involved. So that's a small town that gets generated overnight for at least 2 years while everything's being built. And that from there allows you to build the bones of a town, a small village. And especially if you're a cleric, you will come with your own followers, devotees, and supporters, and they will just flock to your area anyway. Then of course you've got if you're at the right level, you have all of the other men-at-arms and so on. So there's a lot that actually needs to be supported and a lot that needs to be worked on to be able to make happen. So once though you've made a map of the local area, you may even want to make up how many zones the player has to go in, explore, and clean out. And then you've got the monsters that just come back in as the people are in there and they're exploring their own little thing. Ankhegs will move in because they love farmland and they love farms and crops and all of that. Then you've got other beasties that love to eat horses, as well as the ones who are already there that don't like the idea of being moved along or kicked down the road. So when you want everything, once you get to that point and you've got everything cleaned out, what you want to try and do then is to set up what everything will look like. And that means also looking at what the township and the castles and where it's all sitting. So if the character wants to build on a hill, they have to find the right hill. If they want to build it near an ocean, they need to obviously find a patch near an ocean and so on, and a viable port and so on. So there's a lot that they need to work out from themselves, and there's a lot that the DM has to work with to be able to make that happen. So once you get it to the point where you're inhabited and patrolled, then you can start to really build and move into the next phase. Now I turn the page, but absolutely none of this is actually in any particular order because, you know, Gygax. But once you've started to clear out these zones, what you will find is that your fame will increase, and the amount of information about you and your story and the characters and the players and all of that will increase, bringing a lot of people to your territory, or bringing to the player's territory, in order for safety and security. And then now the players are looking after a small fiefdom. They have to look after the people because they are collecting a tithe from these folks as well, and they have got to kick back to their next level up. So there's always money moving from location to location, lots of opportunities for bandits, for robberies and so on. So even if once it becomes a nice inhabited and patrolled area, it doesn't really mean that it becomes entirely safe, especially from a player's point of view, because we like a little bit of chaos thrown in with our breakfast cereal. Since we're doing a little bit of discussion about Greyhawk, it might be worthwhile just opening up a small section here. And what I am looking at specifically is this. So these are the ways that you define how large towns are and what they're called and so on. We might do a bit more about wilderness in a different session, but it's worth covering some of this so that when you see some towns, what they're actually worth in terms of their population size and so on. Large capital cities and large cities aren't like the metropolises that we have today. They are a little bit more, there's less in terms of the population, but because it's harder to deal with those, then obviously less is more. So even a 40,000 population town may not sound like a lot. That's a massive city, and trying to support and keep that fed and cleaned and everything else requires literally a small army. So the players will start with their hamlet, and as they build up their reputations and as they bring more wealth into the land and more opportunity, people will flock, come through and so on, and build it up from there. Probably this is about as high as it'll ever get, but you never know. Maybe they'll make their own capitals one day. Whether it's a walled city, follow the same deal as the other walls around for castle building, or an unwalled, that's depending on the wealth of what they've got to play with. Anyway, so it's interesting just to sort of see some of these things, to put them into context. When you hear that a cleric at 8th level just suddenly has 150 followers that show up, well, that's a hamlet just on its own. So, you know, there's that. So while we're talking briefly about something like a cleric, at 8th level, the cleric can create a church, just a single building structure, and that's really it. It's about the size of a church, and anything upwards of 200 followers just suddenly shows up, as well as a range of armed guards and fanatical militia. We love that. And that's where you could set that up almost anywhere. And that's when you can take a small town and build it up. And then at 9th level, the cleric is able to build their actual stronghold, which then is requiring an additional place of worship that is considerably larger than the one that they can build at 8th level. So you might build a church here, but here you might build your little castle and have more of a cathedral, and then that attracts its own people and so on. So you're close to all of that. Then all of a sudden your religion as the cleric spreads its faith, which can be good if you're in some parts of the land, as long as you're in a similar sort of alignment zone. But if you're over at the Theocracy of the Pale, they don't like competition, so they'll be trying to squash you. And this is another zone where, surrounded by lots of civilized peoples, you have just this wild, crazy area in the middle that no one wants to claim. And there's plenty of that. And we're talking about a medieval period. Now, in terms of Greyhawk, what we're generally looking at is this band here is the more what would be teamed as inhabited and patrolled, and then the areas on the inside here and everywhere else less likely. So whilst Greyhawk is this section of the Greyhawk continent, or the continent of Ulrich and all that, there's a small section in here that's relatively stable, but you've still got lots of areas where there's crazy happening all over the place. Barrier peaks. Just for sheer interest and because it's kind of funny, Gary, Mr. Gygax, also goes into talking about peasants, serfs and slaves, and why you should be nice to people, and what are their chances of armed revolution and causing a civil war, and how players have to quell these things in no short order. It's a little bit humorous in a way, because you just sort of think, wow, you are just being so rational in the way that you've delivered this information. But as I said, if you play any other game, you are able to take all of this quite easily and read from all of this and build on something that's game system agnostic. As I said, apart from where it mentions wandering monsters and just the odd reference, it doesn't even reference siege castles building or anything like that at all. It just talks about it, about the construction. And whilst it's underway, the character needs to keep exploring and needs to keep everybody safe. It does recommend that the DM have several big bads within the hexes, so that the players have something to actively pursue, whether it's obviously some evil group, some warband of orcs or giants, trolls, whatever it is, that they have something that allows them to say, right, we've completed this by clearing out that zone, and pretty much everyone else who's a bad guy has been pushed out into the next area, and never to return, or not to return very often. And that's the whole inhabited and patrolled category. They need to make sure they have patrols and that it is regular. So they're paying for these people to wander around, which comes back to what the players are actually trying to achieve, and so on. What it does recommend also is that there's a chance, should the player decide, you know, I've made my fiefdom, I'm 11th, 12th level, I'm cool, let's start up again with a whole bunch of new characters. Keep that alive as the DM, move them to NPC status, and they can still be used as part of the story arcs, and they can still be part of the tapestry of the land, which is the other thing that the players like to hear about as well. They like to know that their characters have a life beyond their own limited use. So today we've had a quick look at territory development by player characters, and it's well worth a read, and it is a big hefty read. Take a few notes, and in every paragraph there's like about a dozen things you need to think about, which is awesome because we love new ways of playing this game, and you don't realize sometimes how immersive you can become in a game like this. And all of a sudden, yeah, I'm going to build a castle, I'm going to take over an area, I'm going to have a land, I'm going to have all of the, and you just go, well, 1 minute we were dungeon crawling, killing orcs, now we're trying to feed a community. What? Yeah, but it's good. And there's plenty of room for adventure and excitement even beyond making all of this, because as I said, you've got the political intrigue, you've got bandits that are always trying to cause trouble, and there's lots of people who are trying to knock off the person who's in charge, either by challenge or to prove that they're greater, or, you know, the hotshot pistol, the gunslinger mentality, as well as the other local lords in the area that may not like or may wish that something was done with the upstart. But like most player characters, it's not just a single player character, it's the unhinged compatriots. But anyway, so in terms of making a fiefdom, this is really open to clerics and fighters. It's not really something that a magic user would do, so not there within their purview or their style. But with the thieves and assassins having to build their own little clubs, and monks that can build their own monasteries, whilst they don't have to clear out a zone, they'd certainly have to interact with a local area to be able to find ways of making sure that they're still around and can thrive. Druids, as we know, wander into the forest or wander into the wilderness and create their own little groves and holy zones. The bards create conservatoriums for music and exploration of art, but none of these are as defined as the cleric and the fighter, who also build a collection of people, supporters, followers, men-at-arms, and also the generate the taxes and the wealth at however many silver pieces per month. So anyway, all right, this is just to sort of cap off what we were talking about last time, and hopefully you found something useful. If anything else, flick through the DMG pages 93, 94 and have a read, and make sure that you take away what you need to take away from that. Don't be afraid of players wanting to move to that next phase. It's just a new way of play, and it can really help. It can sort of create that that campaign and the milieu. All right, well, thank you very much. Thanks for listening, sticking around, supporting me, and subscribe, like, all of the usual routines. I'm trying to keep up to date with some Patreon work, so there are things that are in front of and behind the wall, but I do my best to try and keep everybody up to date. We've been lucky a little bit in being able to release some new content, but we've just sort of hitting each topic as people are asking me questions, or as I'm thinking of what's the next logical step. So if you've got anything that you'd like to think about or you'd like to discuss, absolutely happy to get involved. All right, thanks, appreciate it, and look forward to the next time. All right, bye. Stay safe, everyone.